everyone. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the Weaviate podcast. Once again, I'm super excited to be joined by Weaviate co-founder Bob Van Light. Bob, thank you so much for joining the podcast again.
Well, thanks for having me on the Weaviate podcast, Connor.
Awesome. And I'm super excited to welcome Guy Podjarny to the Weaviate podcast. Guy co-founded Snyk, a wildly successful cybersecurity company, and is now building Tessl and pioneering the future of AI native development, obviously something we love at Weaviate. Guy, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is so great, Guy. I was texting Connor or slacking Connor actually. So because we saw a couple of other podcasts you were doing and stuff on LinkedIn, I believe, and you were talking about this term AI native, and we were so happy with that because for people who go to the Weaviate website, they see we talk about AI native database, right? So that's like a new term. And also another term that we use is like AI enabled versus AI native. And so we always love to get people's thoughts and opinion and like, what does it actually mean? What is AI native? What is AI enabled? I'm also super curious if it aligns with what we think, because I think it's like the market and the community who's defining that kind of terminology. So we would love to get your take on what your definition is and how you use it at the Tessl.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a certain amount of like defining a term so that you can refer to an entity. So there's maybe like alignment on it is sort of more important than precisely what it is. But I think whenever we embrace a new technology, the easiest way to use it is to pull it into our existing workflows. And so when you think about cloud, for instance, the first thing we did was lift and shift. And we think about that as assisted, as, in this case, kind of, AI assisted later and kind of cloud assisted. But it doesn't change how we do things. We're just sort of looking to things that we're already doing, and they provide, value in automating them. And I think that's a lot of what we're doing today with AI. So when we think about software development, we think about all sorts of things that AI can help us in writing unit tests, writing documentation, completing or sort of making us sort of type code faster, et cetera, et cetera. And we think about that as AI-assisted development. When I think about AI native, it's really when you stop and you think about reworking the workflow itself. So you think, okay, if this was there from the beginning, what is it that we would do differently? And if I was to contrast it to cloud for a sec, in cloud, the lift and shift is the example of the assisted. It's a very, very valuable step that you can do to get out of your data center and go to this sort of elastic capacity environment, and you get all sorts of accelerations and all sorts of cost reductions. But the true opportunity was in cloud native, was in understanding, okay, if I was to rethink how I deploy applications, how I build in the cloud, suddenly you get into microservices, you get into immutable infrastructure, you get into elastic computing even before that, and then you build those into the applications, and the value is much greater. So I think that's what I think about with AI native. We'll talk a little bit about why it's harder to achieve. So when we say at Tessl, when we think about AI native, we think what is the native way. If you were to sort of embrace AI and notably LLMs, you say, okay, machines can now create code. What can we do differently when we think about software development? And that's what we call AI native software development.
Yeah, that is super, super interesting. It's like personally, I sometimes use this, analogy, I guess, or not even an analogy, but as an example, I say, I always like a simple way to look at it is like if you take two applications, one application is AI enabled and the other one is AI native. Right? If you take the machine learning or the models out of the AI enabled solution, it will still work. It just has less features, right?
Yeah.
The AI native one, if you take the models out and the AI out, it just stops working. It doesn't exist anymore. It's like it's the heart of the solution, and that I think that's important, not even from a technical perspective, but also from a use case perspective, because this one is just doing stuff more and better, great, but this one is doing new stuff, right? So building new applications, new tooling for developers, but also new consumer applications and those kind of things. So that is how I look at it. But I'm curious because you mentioned cloud native, and of course that was like kind of the previous big wave, if you will.
Right.
What kind of lessons from uh, cloud native can we plot on AI native? So before we go into the differences, what is the same? What have we learned in this whole cloud native wave that we can now use in becoming AI native?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think we're first of all we're like a little bit better off because we have cloud native to contrast to, and I don't know really what was the previously well defined transition that happened. We had mobile social, but I think that's a little bit different. Maybe the mobile web was a part of that. Before that, it was the internet. It was really things that I don't know. Like they created maybe more of the native, more of the sort of the brand new, and so it was a bit hard to address. So I think we're probably having this conversation in large part because of cloud native. I think a key learning is the difference between technology and people. I think that's a big deal. So cloud native development is all good and well, but or cloud native applications in terms of how they're built. But the real change wasn't really that. It wasn't how you build the applications, which was significant. It was around the processes. It was how do you work. It was the skills that you needed. It was maybe the responsibilities of different parts of the organization, like all of those things. They were the digital transformation part of cloud native, and that was the bigger lift. It wasn't really whatever having the tools to deploy continuously or having cloud asset management platforms. It was having methodologies that first of all like you can rely on. So there was a certain amount of natural time that has to happen because people had to demonstrate that they work. But then subsequently, um, like these things are scary for individuals, right? Like they made the organizations better, but for individuals, they can be costly or just jarring, and people might need to change them up. And so I think that's probably like the biggest one that comes to mind. And I think maybe the last thing I would say, which is a bit of an offshoot of this, is that it's helpful. It's been helpful in cloud native
Yeah.
to compartmentalize. And so not to try and change your entire sort of software stack in one go, but rather to take a subset of the organization, give them kind of autonomy, right? Take a group, take a
Mm.
team, take a section, give them the autonomy, the sort of the mandate to kind of pioneer this sort of new horizon, and then work with them. So yeah, I think those are three. There are probably a lot more, but I think those are the three that jump to mind.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I think so that what I find interesting and what's so different with AI is, and I've spoken a couple of times about this, is about like the models being stateless. So, and what do I mean with that? So, one thing that we've learned from cloud native is that at an abstract level, if we see how businesses evolve around that, right? So we enable the developers to rather do it in their own in their own garage or in
Yeah.
their own server rack to do that in the cloud. Great. But then what we learned was that the value or the way that we can capture that value, right, is by maintaining state. So if you look at like how a lot of businesses are built, like regardless if it's AWS or specific database companies or other infrastructure companies, it is like they maintain state for you, and you get like an SLA to make sure that that state is guaranteed and that kind of stuff. But what's so interesting with the models is that there's no state. So sure, there is like the operational side of things, but let's be honest, that's also where the value is being captured also on the hardware infrastructure level. So I'm super curious how you see how these businesses that purely focus on the models, how you think that how they will evolve. And I also would love to get your take on the open source angle here. So, what do you think that open source did? And I would love to know where you're bullish, where you're bearish on that kind of stuff. I would love to know your thoughts on all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting that you sort of say that it removes the state. Like on one hand, you're absolutely correct. Like the models themselves are stateless. You give them context and they spit out an answer. On the other hand, the entire model is a state, isn't it? Like it is taking a lot of the data that you have, a lot of the uh, uh, decisions that you have around what is correct and incorrect. Like all of those basically get somewhat reduced down to these sort of matrices of numbers that represent the model, and then those in turn I think reproduce the state. So from a business perspective, you actually have a lot of state, and you to an extent encode that state into the model itself, into your fine-tuning of the model, into the definitions. And that relates to me a little bit to sort of the future of the models, right? You can think of sort of three levels maybe of model related companies, right? And this is independent of like Tessl, for instance, which is an application layer company, right? And I don't know, maybe Weaviate, you'd sort of define that as well. I think you might be a bit more in between, but the model companies themselves, you'd have the fundamental kind of infrastructural companies that are maybe dealing with a state, with sort of a data estate that is so vast and so complicated to compute and process that they're competing on scale. And I think those companies, I think it'll be very, very hard to compete with. So I think those are like the giants of the world, the cloud giants of it, because they go hand in hand with the ability to deal with large data, with large compute quantities of it. But between them, they will be, I think they will be they will be competitive, and they will keep championing. And there's, at this point, maybe two or three startups, Anthropic, OpenAI, clearly, that have kind of maybe broken through, and you can debate. I don't think anybody else can really like deal with the scale. And for them, I think this will become a somewhat of a commodity business, but it'll be large in volumes, so not that different to sort of selling compute. Right? Does that make sense? Like I think that's the sort of the basic level.
No, it does make sense. It's just the thing with the and I'm happy to be wrong on the nomenclature. So maybe like that
Yeah.
stateless might be wrong, but the way how I think about it is the I always compare it with MP3 files, right? And back in the day with when we had
Yeah.
like when Napster, came along, right? So that that we've kind of learned. So if you take this as an analogy, right? So musician goes into the studio, they record, you have all these settings in
Yeah.
the instruments, the machinery, what have you, and then a snapshot, a state snapshot is it's like it's a snapshot in time, and that is encoded all the way down to this MP3 file, right? And now we have that song that is stateless. So the artist is not ending any more music or any
No,
more
no, it's
lyrics or
it's a
whatever.
static in that case. Yeah, it's
Yes.
sort of it's done, it's shipped. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then the value back before the internet sat in the distribution channels, right? So the record labels and that kind of stuff who were able to handle that kind of volume of distribution. Now, if the analogy with the models is that for me, the models, yes, it's a snapshot in time state,
Yeah.
but after that kind of stateless. So it has like a similar market dynamic, I think, as an MP3 file, and in the sense that at some point, or the model becomes just available on your device, or it just sits at a very easy to use endpoint at whatever cloud provider you use, who's controlling the distribution channel. But then the question is like, now, especially with these open source models, and now what we see with companies like Olama, just run it on your laptop and they keep optimizing it and improving it and what have you, that we might get to a situation like we back in the day just we're downloading MP3 files on our computer. We're gonna go to just using a model that we like, or maybe they just all level out to like a similar
To the
quality, and then we
same
just
now.
like I was like we
I
don't
think,
really
yeah,
care.
it's a good challenge, and I do think some of that is correct. But I guess I would guess that the way that you customize the model is going to be critical for business competitiveness.
Mm.
And so So maybe the foundational model, I think you're right, and maybe whatever, we can kind of nitpick the stateless, whether that's the right term or the other, but there will be commodity, there will be a baseline, there will be something that you just use and continue. I think it's more of an engine than the MP3 file. It's maybe more the sort of the recorder of it that you keep using, and so it's a little bit hard because you use it dynamically. But I do think that for businesses to be competitive, the users, for the businesses using those models, they will need to constantly refine it to their business. And I think most businesses will change. And so if you want to encode like the body of law maybe into your applications, maybe that doesn't change as dynamically, but interpretations and cases and all of those, they do happen, right? So that data flows through your application, flows by you, whether you use it internally or externally. And I think your ability to kind of fine tune the model. So fine, sometimes it's RAG and it's sort of context about what to pull in. Sometimes it is fine tuned. Maybe there's sort of other, like there will be other ways that get invented. But I think like interweaving your insights, your data with the models will be pretty simple. And so like to an extent your I find myself kind of wondering about whether the word state is or isn't correct here, but like the running system, it's probably more analogous in some ways to source code that you modify and you ship, and you are the best if you are shipping that code quickly. Right? The more adaptive you are, the more adaptable you are to changes in your knowledge, the more frequently you ship an evolution of that state or that code, the better it is. But it probably is more analogous to that than it is to runtime state. So in that sense, I agree.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And I out of this, I'm very curious to take get a little bit closer also to Tessl, right? So because I always curious because I'm a first time founder, right? So I don't know how this feels, but you obviously are a very successful founder, and so you're in the security space, right? So and you could spend the rest of your life in there, right, and do all kinds of great things. But so you see something in the market related to this AI nativeness, and you go like, I'm gonna jump, like I'm gonna go head first into this one. What did you see? What did you how did that what did you see? And I would love to understand also what the vision is with Tessl and how that relates to that AI nativeness.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, definitely wasn't an obvious decision for me to jump in and found another company. Snyk is still a passion, and it's still doing very, very well. And I'm still on the board, so I haven't like entirely left. But it was still a big move to switch and found Tessl. I guess what I saw is an opportunity to reimagine software development, and I really do think that today we use AI well. Like I love these tools, Copilot and Codium and Swim, and like all these like generate and sort of parts of your work and remove the toil and move with those. I think AI assisted development tools are very valuable, but I really think they're just the beginning. Specifically, I think the real opportunity with AI native software development is to move from a code-centric development to a spec-centric development. And so I think today what happens is you get a bunch of requirements, you write some code. As soon as you wrote the code, you've made 100 decisions that never make it out of the code. And they continue to evolve, and they range in small and big. And in general, the code ends up coupling what needs to be done and how to do it. And they're both in the code. And you might ask questions, or when you come to bugs, or when you introduce a new developer into it, or when you're processing a feature request, you're always coupling these questions of what is the code doing and how it's doing. If you're saying add a promotional pop-up in the middle of before the shopping cart purchase option, then first you need to understand like what is the code doing, like what is happening when I click this button, the shopping cart process down, what is that even in the system? And then you also need to understand how is it implemented and modify all of the above. And I think that's fine. That's kind of the reality we have. And it resulted in a software development process that is very code centric. So because the truth is in the code, because the code couples both what and how to do it, then the whole software factory focuses on, writing and editing and reviewing and collaborating on and packaging and versioning, et cetera, code. And what I think is that we're going to move to a place that the user will have a means to specify what it is that they want to develop, which is not trivial, and AI will handle the implementations. And AI, this is an evolution. It's not going to happen overnight. AI is there's limits to what it can do today, but there's a lot it already can. But because AI will handle these implementations, the implementations will be adaptable, and so suddenly every piece of software you create can be multi-language. You want a JavaScript version, you want a Python version, no problem. You want an Android version, you want an iPhone version, sure. You want a AWS, GCP, you want it low latency, you want it low cost, you want it a little bit different at night than what you want it during the day. All of those can be adapted because AI will adapt the implementations. And these implementations can be closer to data. They can be much more connected to telemetry and how the system does, and sort of be constantly improved. And those improvements can kind of be related, and that results in them being more personalized. Can you create software that is really attuned to your infrastructure, to your needs, that can change with your system? And there's more and more, like, maintenance will pretty much go away, because maintenance is really just adapting to your local context. It's just like a change in your underlying software, or software you depend on, or a service you depend on. And those and many more will be very, very different ways of building software that ends up focusing the developer, this future developer, this AI native developer, on defining what it is that they want, and AI will create this sort of new version. And I draw the analogy again to cloud, which, asking the question, what will be the world if you can create an implementation with an API call? Right? If you can just create an implementation to your needs, would these implementations become immutable, that the code actually never evolves? It just always gets kind of regenerated. There are all sorts of security implications. Anyways, it's a brave new world. And fundamentally, we think that building applications, developing applications in this fashion requires a different software factory, that it's a different set of tools and workflow that you need to write and edit and version and collaborate on and package specs and adaptable implementations. And that's what we're setting out to do.
Yeah, this is super interesting. And so first of all, I think that intuition, I feel that too. And I think, Connor, I think we're both, also what you're doing with the gent feedback loops and that kind of stuff, is like that intuition, we have that too, right? So there are just two things that I'm just very curious, like on a conceptual level, to get your thoughts on. So the first thing is, like, I'm a logic nerd. I just, in language, I like that kind of stuff. I don't know why, but I like it. And one thing that I find interesting is that if we do it something specs based, then we're getting to a very much a a subjective nature of what the user wants. And the example that I often give there is that, let's say that I have a spec, and that spec is functioning as input to a prompt. And the spec is very simple, and it's like, I want to see a red circle in HTML, right? CSS HTML, red circle, right? The problem is that the thing will most definitely render something, but how big is it? What kind of red is it? That kind of stuff, right? And so now you're saying, well, it needs to be smaller. So then, but then before you know it, how much smaller? You're going to say, well, 20 pixels smaller. And then before you know it, it turned into like a formal language, which looks a lot like a programming language. So what I find interesting is that if we do something specs based, and I think, like, wasn't that also one of the goals of, like, a COBOL back in the day, to have like a more spec based kind of language? Don't we run the risk of ending up with formal languages that resemble programming languages, like, by a lot? Or is that maybe a good thing and it sits the innovation somewhere else?
No, I think it's a very fair question, and to an extent, there's elements of what we're building that is a higher level abstraction language, as has happened. I'd say maybe two things to your question. One is it's important to separate between a spec and a prompt. So, like prompts are disposable; they are a UX element to describe to the system. Something gets generated. For instance, for most AI tools, code gets generated and then they're discarded. They're no longer around, and the code remains a source of truth. Specs are long-lived. Specs are the representation of what the system should do, and they're not trivial to think about what makes up a spec on it. And so that's maybe just like a small but important comment, because a lot of the examples we have around are examples of prompts. Hey, make this, make this like that. That's okay. And it might be a UX for generating the spec, but eventually you have a spec that does represent the system. The second and probably bigger change is that specs are, that now that we have AI, specs don't have to be complete. They just have to include the pieces of software or the pieces of requirements that represent what it is that is important to you. And so, you might not care about a button having square corners or rectangle or corners. And so you don't need to specify that. You can delegate that decision to AI. And there's a whole domain around how do you know how to trust AI, right? If I was to, if you're an outsourcing shop. I love the outsourcing analogy in general. I think it works very well. If you're an outsourcing shop that specializes in building marketing websites, and you've already built 6 marketing websites for me, and I'm coming to you and I'm asking for you to build a 7th, I need to give you a much smaller spec because I am comfortable delegating something to you. If I've not worked with you, but you're well regarded in the industry and my friends have worked with you and you're very expensive and you're doing that, I might feel like I need to specify less to you as I would maybe a higher end developer versus some low cost offshore development shop that don't have that reputation and are very cheap. And so we've built mechanisms in the ecosystem around when can we rely on human intelligence, and we haven't really built those for artificial intelligence, and we have to figure them out. But fundamentally, the spec should represent, the spec and the system should represent some combo where on one hand, we need to find the opportunities in which we want to delegate decisions that we didn't have that ability before to the AI. And the second is that we need to separate between persistence and decisions. And so, once you might not have cared if your button is blue or red, but once it was chosen to be blue, you don't want the next version to just randomly turn it into red. You want some persistence. And we separate, for instance, between a regression test and functional test. In functional test, the source of truth is the spec. And in regression test, the source of truth is the previous version. And you shouldn't make changes that are not due to a change of the spec, or at the very least, if those happen, you should surface them, and the user will relate to them. So those are some examples. I would sort of say what we're building, what we're envisioning, it will take a while to come into full fruition. Is a process that is attended. It's not unattended. There has unattended components, and it should allow the users to represent their taste, their preferences, their choices within it. It's good. You want it that if myself or Connor or you, Bob, or anybody else uses the same spec, to allow us to create a different application because we represent our preferences. And AI will help encode your preferences. It will help capture them. It will help learn them automatically and explicitly and evolve them over time. But it should be different than needing to know all the nitty-gritty. It should allow us to be creators, not maintainers. It should do all this other goodness around it. As it develops the software with us.
That's super interesting, and that actually brings me to another question, because I think nowadays, I think people listening to this, they might agree that nowadays when we talk about good software, means it's very readable, right? So that if you bring in another developer who can read it,
Yeah.
and can understand it and do whatever they want with the software, right? So would it be fair to say that with this specs based developing, that actually becomes less important. So it's like maybe a little bit cheesy example, but just to make my point is that nowadays you might see front end developers writing beautiful TypeScript, but that gets compiled into something
Mhm.
that's easy to download in the browser, like the minified and that kind of stuff, or whatever the language is nowadays used for that. And um, but basically, you could now go from spec to minified, or why would you care what kind of variables it uses if it just figured out that it does a better, I don't know, memory mapping if you use a certain variable to store something in whatever, right?
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that readability of the code is just shifting then to the spec?
I think we talk about this a fair bit. At the beginning, I think it wouldn't for two reasons. One, LLMs are trained on code. And so, ironically, it's easier for them to create beautiful code than it is to create
Mm,
minified code. And the words in the functions and all of those, they actually matter to them. So the interaction is human. And because this is a kind of an automated code generation, software generation system, there's no reason why that beautiful code is ever going to be the thing that is packaged and shipped. It might as well be minified and optimized further down the road. But
mm,
the code that is generated is probably better this way. Second reason is trust, and so the reality is that today, in part legitimately, in part just habit building for developers. If I gave you this access to the system and you'd write a spec and you would create the code, you would probably want to look at the code and you'd probably want to build confidence in the fact that the system works. This is not that dissimilar from the advent of Java bytecode or new compilers or things like that, where some people would dig in. So you'd want to look at it, you'd want to comment on it. I'd go further and say at the beginning, the code generation itself is also attended. So if you're a developer and you're developing software like this and you understand the code, I would want your input to both make the system better, but also to make the application more aligned. We talk about code as a communication vehicle. Sometimes explaining what you want the system to do, if you do know how to code, is actually easier by saying, here, something like this, and you write a piece of code, a bit of a show not tell example. And so all of those reasons drive us towards actually having the code that gets generated actually be very readable, be very kind of human friendly, if you will. Over
mm,
time, I do think that changes. So over time, the importance of this interim artifact to be human readable will diminish. And maybe on the flip side, the importance of it being AI readable becomes more important to understand maybe annotations that relate to the code that got generated into spec components, maybe other sort of attributes and things like that, maybe tags for telemetry because it gets connected to telemetry. So can you actually make it very heavily annotated? And funny enough, sometimes it'll be shorter. Sometimes it might even be more excessively verbose. It's like every
mm.
single thing that it does. And later on, you clean it up, but like make it very verbose in a way that makes it actually unpleasant to humans sometimes because it's just a lot of overhead to read through. But maybe that becomes the AI friendly. So, anyways, there's a lot that needs to be evolved there. But at the beginning, trust is important. Maybe if I ramble, I'd say, like, before we talked about the difficulty in accepting change for humans. When I think about AI solutions, I actually think about them in two dimensions. I think about change and I think about trust. And so think about a change axis that goes from existing workflows to new workflows, and think about a trust axis that goes from fully attended to fully unattended. And if this was a 2x2, then for solutions to get adoption today, they kind of need to be at the bottom left. They need to be in the sort of the low change, low trust. So if you're completing my code, if you're writing an SDR email for me, if you're generating an image for a blog post, if you're pointing out something on an X-ray, all of those things are things I'm already doing. AI is the assistant,
Mm.
and it's just helping. It's just giving me superpowers. Why wouldn't it? As long as it's accurate enough that it's not noise, I'm happy to use it. And I can eyeball and sort of see that it's correct. So there's very little trust. So those are the solutions you're seeing getting the most adoption today. If you climb up the trust vector, then you get to solutions that either are bigger in scope, right? You go from writing a paragraph to writing the next chapter in a book to writing the next book in a series. They're bigger, and the human becomes the editor instead of the AI being the assistant. And you can't really be an editor if the AI is not good enough. So you trust it to do a good enough job, or they're just sort of, you need trust for assistant, right? Like an X-ray being diagnosed by AI. Without like autonomously, right, in the fully at the very top of that, and so I think that trust vector is one that would evolve with time, and the change vector we talked about already, right? It goes from the things that you work today to this sort of AI native practices to rethinking the workflow. And I think the future sits in the top right. But if you built a thing that is for the top right now, nobody would use it because you don't have enough trust and it's too much change. And so you need to, if you're to build a new solution over here, you need to think about a vision that points you to the top right, but you need to think about a journey that begins at the bottom left, that you kind of help your users, your customers walk through.
No.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Connor. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I just wanted to quickly, like, AI has really been teaching me how to code. Like, I haven't had too many years of software engineering, and I'm trying to build a React app, and it'll completely explain the concept to me of like, this JavaScript code renders the blog post style. And I'm like, wow, what a cool concept. I've never wrapped my head around that concept before. So I'm curious what you think about just like kind of the AI, like, you mentioned the trust and how much of that trust is going to come from the AI maybe explaining humans code. Like, I know you both have years of experience with software, probably know all these. Like, I'll be talking to Cloud and it'll explain a design pattern to me, and I'll have never heard of this concept before, and I'll start trying to do the design pattern. Like, how much of it is the AI is teaching us how to code rather than you say, AI explaining the code to other AI?
I think, look, over time, I think coding will be a dying practice. I think coding is a tool that helps us translate our needs into a language that computers can understand. And I think we now have better translators. And so fundamentally, I think coding will probably sort of still be around for a long time because technology takes a long time to die, and because it allows us very fine-grained control. So for certain use cases, we would want that level of control. But for most people, I think the need to code will reduce. I think an AI native developer will go down one of two routes. Either he or she will become a product manager. So like one path is for them to become more focused on the user needs and what is it that they want to do, or they will go down the path of an architect. And if you're sort of passionate about solving problems, I mean, when you think about an architect, you look at anybody, at a likely progression path of a lot of individual contributors and developers. Architects don't code much. Over time, like they might review code. Over time, they don't even review much code. They deal with a bigger system. They deal with logical decisions. They make decisions. They make trade-offs. They make they apply both taste and preference and historical knowledge to say, hey, this business domain, this problem that we have over here, it's more important for us to optimize for agility around adding fields in this domain because I can anticipate us doing that versus maybe having an optimal data structure for the exact fields that we have right now. Those sort of future elements that I think will continue to needs to be there for all the things that are not articulated in the spec, all the possibilities, and sometimes there's choices, right? Because sometimes there are multiple ways to doing it. So I think right now it's amazing actually how valuable it is to sort of still use AI to learn how to code. I've used it myself to sort of dive into new APIs, new domains. So it's not just if you're a non-coder, and also I'm a fairly rusty developer at this point. So if I jump into writing some code, I could use the help. But I think over time, am I happy for my kids to really invest now, 5 years in some sort of educational institution to learn how to code? It's hard for me to recommend that. If they learn architecture, if they learn these sort of higher level principles of how software operates, that I get. If they learn, sort of the syntaxes of multiple languages, if you learn how to write an efficient, Q-sort algorithm, I don't think that's the best use of their time.
Yeah, and this also makes me very optimistic about all this kind of stuff, because how I'm listening to this, basically the example that you just gave, Connor, and what you said, Guy, um, is basically this gives more room and time for creativity, right? So we can spend more time thinking and architecting what do we want to build, what do we want to make, rather than figuring out the practice of actually writing it in this case. I
And
find this, yeah.
I
Sorry,
was
go
just
ahead.
sort of saying it allows more people to be creators as well, right? Like Connor, you'd be able to create more React components than you ever imagined, right? And full-on applications and a lot more. You just wouldn't need that middle step of translating it to the kind of hard of hearing computer that needs you to describe things in such precise language.
Yeah, and I'm also very curious what that will do on a bigger scale, on a cultural scale. I once been to a conference in it was on Iceland, and it was in Reykjavik, and it was in the name of the conference was, it was material. It was before COVID, so I don't know if the conference still exists, but I went to the very first edition of the conference, very small, and the the goal of the conference was to have people who work with software or fully in the digital domain learn how it is to work with physical things, right? How that's different. And so the
Right.
speakers were mostly actually people who were like, carpenters and that kind of stuff. But I remember in the opening of the keynote at that conference, they showed and I believe it was like a huge like crossbow or something that DaVinci drew. And I might get this story wrong, so people fact checking me might
Roughly,
be
yeah.
off here a little bit, but roughly. And the thing was that DaVinci made assumptions about lumbering and those kind of things, things that were known, or that were like, commonly known back in the day, that today we don't know anymore. So even if we take the same specs that Da Vinci wrote down, we can't rebuild the thing anymore because the knowledge on how to do it is lost. And the point that the presenter was making, he was making an analogy with the action script in Flash. So Connor, you're too young for this, I think, but I think Guy, you will still remember the
Yeah.
Flash
I've
website.
uh, I've uh, had the joy of being familiar with it. Yeah.
And so the question that he asked, like to the people at the conference, was like, of course, losing that knowledge about like this lumber knowledge and how to deal with the wood and that kind of stuff, that just took many, 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 many years to just get lost. But with ActionScript, it was like, I believe that Steve Jobs wrote an open letter, and it was kind of gone, right?
Yeah.
And he asked the question, what did we lose with losing all these developers that learn how to build in Flash and with ActionScript? Did we lose something? Did we lose some kind of a creative like knowledge, if you will? And I'm
Yeah.
very interested to, if we lose that knowledge, right? So because people now, yeah, they go from being coders to spec writers, I guess that they're called. It's very interesting to see if, like, what will we lose from a creativity perspective if we just don't write in these languages anymore, and if we just go directly from spec to output. I guess this is not really a question, more like a rhetorical
Yeah,
question, but
no, I understand, and I think there's no doubt that AI introduces a lot of creative destruction, right? It takes away a bunch of activity and a bunch of knowledge, while it sort of makes a lot of that type of skill or capability available to others, right? I can't draw to save my life, but I am producing all sorts of visuals right now with AI that I couldn't before. So it allows me means of expressing myself, or visualizing something that I couldn't, and putting aside all the sort of the copyright aspect of it. I think it is powerful, and I think there's always some amount of loss. I do think uh, you know just sort of riffing off this a little bit, I think a lot about creation with AI, right? And we talk about it. And I do want to clarify, kind of, you mentioned our podcast, right? Like I have the AI native dev podcast. By the way, like I had the secure developer podcast before. I'm not very creative with names. So the secure developer podcast continues to run. It has a different host. Now there's the AI native dev. You can maybe sort of sense a pattern. And in the podcast, we do talk about like both AI assisted development tools and all that, because I think the learning in the process and the iterations on it is a journey. You don't just sort of land into the sort of AI native, and about the destination, about the AI native dev. And so I think that's great. I think a little bit on the podcast, a bit more sort of it's sort of less for developers. I talk a lot about, or think a lot about, creating with AI, and I think about what is creating with AI like, and sometimes it is about the context you provide. So today the AI is either the assistant, or either the AI is the assistant, or the AI is the creator and the human is the editor, right? Like those are really the two modes. But you were just telling the story about the conference you were in, right? And you told the story, and you probably told this story before, and you told the same story, but you told it different, right? If you called your mom right now and you told her their story, you'd tell the story differently. If you're in an elevator, you had 30 seconds, you'd tell it differently. So every time it's the same story, but every time you contextualize it, you adapt it to the current surrounding, and you tell it a little bit different. So there's some essence that's hard to define, some spec, if you will, right? Like some sort of core to that story, and you contextualize it every time. And we do that, right? You got up on stage, you'd tell the story, it'll be different. And I think it's very interesting to think about kind of creation with AI in that context. Like what is possible if you could define that sort of essence of the story. And now I could listen to that story. It says, well, I want to hear this story, but I want it to be done by the time I get off this train. I want to hear the story, but I want it to take place in Tokyo or in London, right? I want to hear the story, but I want it, less explicit because I want it kid friendly. And I think the same maybe could be applied to music. I love 90s rock, but sometimes I want soft music, and can I create that? Or sometimes the words are an issue. Can I create those? And those are they're scary. Like there's a lot of creative destruction in this. Like what happens to to the musicians here, to the writers? Like a lot of people don't like that. There's a lot that gets lost, but there's also like new breeds. My son is very much into music, and he's a sort of great music. He's 14 years old, sort of creates a bunch of music, and he thinks, we talk a lot about AI. It's like, will it take the jobs? And it's like, well, like, look, you sit at your computer and you create, drum sounds and sort of, cello sounds and all that. There's no drum, there's no cello, you're just creating those sounds. Did that destroy music? Like, you're creating that music and, electric guitars. And so I think it's different forms, and they will definitely cause change. I think we have to embrace that. Change is the only constant. But I don't know, maybe it's just the optimist in me, but I think a lot of it is to think about what is the possibility. Like just sort of think about how much new types of music did electronic music create. I think we talked a little bit about state at the beginning. It's interesting to think about actually everything that is static, that MP3 file that got produced, it no longer needs to be static. Now you can have that MP3, but it can be adapted, that when I listen to it on the way to work and on the way back from work, I listen to something else. I listen to something different.
Yeah,
I find that pretty exciting.
No, I 100% agree with you. And I think that change, that is just since, the beginning of technology, right? And doesn't matter if you're like in a creative profession or not. I mean, I would argue that in some sense everybody is, but that's another story. But the thing is that people will use the tooling to be creative in a different way. That's just a fact of life. So I think that's going to be fine. And the same is for what you said about your, with your son. He'll figure something out, right? How to use it or
Yeah.
how to play, right? So that'll be fine. I think the also I'm just too excited also for what's happening now to just have any pessimistic view about this, because I really think it will open up more possibilities than not. And what's interesting, what you're saying about the MP3 file becoming personalized or dynamic. I remember, and I've used it actually in a couple of talks that I gave, that I think a year back or something, somebody released a couple of these YouTube trailers, because they're not real trailers, but of like Wes Anderson adoptions of
Right. Yeah, yeah. I saw those.
Star
Yeah.
Wars. And when I saw that, and you saw the video, and you could think of the audio, the text, and that kind of stuff, I was like, this is it. This is where it's going. We're gonna be in just a handful of years from now. The three of us will have the same Netflix subscription. We'll watch the same series, but based on the specs of the series,
Yeah.
it will be rendered differently based on what we've looked at previously, right? That was like boom. I was like, I could see this. I was like, the infrastructure is not 100% there yet, but we're working on that, so we'll solve that problem. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's gonna happen, and that makes me just super super excited. I have one more question. I don't know, Connor, if you want to add another question, but I have one more question because I could imagine that people listening to this, they're going to be super excited about Tessl, and they're going to want to know, like, can you already share something about how will people be able to use it, or what's your vision for that? Will there be an open source component to it or not? For example, the spec definitions, will they be different? What can people expect when they can start to play around with Tessl?
Yeah, it's hard. Like I'm happy. I get what's weird about sort of founding a company after Snyk, and this is my third startup, is
Yeah.
that unlike in my previous two, people actually think I might succeed this time, which is odd and somewhat unnerving. In the previous two, there was no doubt. Of course, this is going to fail, and so it's interesting. I kind of get more interest. At the moment, we're still we write a lot at Tessl.io on the blog, and we talk about in our podcast in the AI Native Dev about the concepts, and we bring smart people and we roll those out. We're working quickly kind of on this sort of platform to try out. It'll have sort of an interesting, I think, open source angle to it, so a bit of stay tuned to it. But yeah, like right now, there still isn't anything to try. If you go to Tessl.io and you register, then we'll make sure you're sort of early in the know to be an alpha tester and try those out. I do believe, I don't think you build the right products if you sort of stay in your cave too long, right? So with Snyk, one of the core operating principles was ship it, and I believe the same here. When you build a new software development paradigm and a new software development platform, it takes a moment to build a minimum viable product, and so it's taking us a little bit longer, but we're hard at work on it.
Thank you so much for joining us. This was wonderful. This was awesome.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Always fun to discuss this, and you definitely need to get some AI native musicians on the on the podcast for the next ones.
We should. Thanks, Guy.